right, so boys and girls, before we start part 2 in our reading, I want you to pull out your comprehension guide and I want you to turn back to the very first page, chapter 8, part 1, Dance at Grandpa's. And I want to see how you guys did. Let's look at number 1. It says, why are Ma and Pa in a hurry to get to Grandpa's? Now I want you to take your book, and I want you to turn to page 131. And I want you to listen as I read the very first sentence or two. You have to be good detectives when you're reading and try to comprehend or understand what you're reading. So listen what it says. Monday morning, everybody got up early in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. So how could you say that in a shortened version or a shortened answer to answer the question number 1? Why are Ma and Pa in a hurry to get to Grandpa's? All right, so we know that Ma has to help with what? She has to help with the cooking. And Pa has to help with what? He's going to help make the syrup from the sap. So they have 2 jobs they need to do. So figure out a way where you can write a complete sentence telling why Ma and Pa are in a hurry, or check over your work to see that you have a complete sentence and that your answer is correct. Number 3 says, whose house is smaller, Laura or Grandma's? Now look at page 133. It says Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much what? What's the very last sentence on that page? It was much larger than their house at home. So that one was pretty easy. Look at number 4. At the top of page 134, it says, list the names of the people who live with Grandma and Grandpa. Well, right at the top, it lists 3 names, Uncle George, Aunt Docia, and Aunt Ruby. Now, you can't just put their names and leave that. That is not a complete sentence. You would finish that by saying, Uncle George, Aunt Docia, and Aunt Ruby live with Grandma and Grandpa, and you would put a period at the end. Now, look at number 5. It's also on page 134. It says the men had taken their dinners to the Maplewoods. Now, it asks you, what does Grandma serve for lunch when the men are working out in the Maplewoods? Now, some people call lunch dinner, and they call an evening meal supper. So it says for dinner, they did not set the table, but they ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. That was their lunch or dinner. And it says, but for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding. So your answer is very straightforward. So you want to write both of those in complete sentences. And then number 6 says, how do the men carry the buckets of syrup? And if you look at page 136, it actually shows you a picture of, I guess it's Grandpa carrying the buckets of syrup, and it goes into detail about how he carries the buckets of syrup. And it says they steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yoke on their shoulders. So that tells you exactly how they did it. You can write this complete sentence, or you can shorten it up and write it the way you would like to write it. Number 7, why is Laura afraid to touch Ma after she dresses for the dance in her Delane? Well, remember how it talked about how special that dress was. And so if you look on page 142, and in that top paragraph section, if you go towards the bottom of the first paragraph, it says, Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was afraid to touch her. So think about it. If your mom had on a beautiful, gorgeous dress and was going somewhere very special with your dad, why would you be afraid to touch that beautiful dress? And so you write in your own words the answers to that one. And for now, we're going to start on part 2 of Dance at Grandpa's. So we're actually going to turn to page 144 because we ended on 143 where the two little Lauras are arguing about who is the prettiest baby. So turn to page 144 and we'll begin there. Get your tracking fingers out. Oh, before we do that, let's look at our questions. It helps us to be good detectives. So let's look. Number 1, where are all the babies during the dance? Number 2, why did the two Lauras argue? And I think I just gave you that answer. Number 3, where is Grandma and what is she doing while everyone is dancing? Number 4, why do you think Laura cannot keep her feet still? Now, we accidentally forgot to white this answer out, so you get a freebie on number 4. Number 5, after jigging for a while, Uncle George's boots do not thump quite as loudly as they had at first. Why? And you've got 4 multiple choice options and you're to choose one. How does Uncle George signal that he is finished jigging? And number 7, what are the 3 special things that are made from the sap of the sugar maple trees? Now, let's pay attention, get your tracking finger out, and follow along with me. Read with your mom and dad or read independently. No, she isn't. Ma came sailing over in her fine Delane and said severely, Laura! So neither Laura said anything more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing the bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of its box and began to play, and all the couple stood in a square on the floor and began to dance when Pa called the figures. Grand right and left, Pa called out, and all the skirts began to swirl, and all the boots began to stamp. The circles went round and round, all the skirts going one way and all the boots going the other way, and hands clasping and parting high up in the air. Swing your partners, Pa called out, and each gent bow to the lady on the left. They all did as Pa said. Laura watched Ma's skirt swaying and her little waist bending and her dark head bowing, and she thought Ma was the loveliest dancer in the world. The fiddle was singing, Oh, you buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight? Aren't you coming out tonight? Aren't you coming out tonight? Oh, you buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight to dance by the light of the moon? The little circles and the big circles went round and round, and the skirts swirled and the boots stamped, and partners bowed and separated and met and bowed again. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music. By the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured it on some of the snow in a saucer. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing the Irish washerwoman now. He called, Do-si, ladies, do-si-do, come down heavy on your heel and toe. Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed. Then he caught her by the hand and did a little dance with her in the corner. She liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing over by the kitchen door. They were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma's dress was beautiful, too. A dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was in her hand. I can't leave the syrup, she said. But Pa began to play, the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap in time to the music. So Grandma bowed to them all and did a few steps by herself. She could dance as prettily as any of them. The clapping almost drowned the music of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed her spoon to somebody. She put her hands on her hips and faced Uncle George and everybody shouted. Grandma was jigging. Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all the other clapping hands. The fiddle sang as it had never sung before. Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. Everybody was excited. Uncle George kept on jigging and Grandma kept on facing him, jigging too. The fiddle did not stop. Uncle George began to breathe loudly and he wiped sweat off his forehead. Grandma's eyes twinkled. "You can't beat her, George," somebody shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging. So did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and all the men were teasing George. George did not care, but he did not have breath enough to laugh. He was jigging. Pa's blue eyes were snapping and sparking. He was standing up watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings. The bow danced over the fiddle strings. Laura jumped up and down and squealed and clapped her hands. Grandma kept on jigging. Her hands were on her hips and her chin was up, and she was smiling. George kept on jigging, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. Grandma's heels kept on clickety-clackety gaily. A drop of sweat dripped off George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up both arms and gasped, "I'm beat." He stopped jigging. Everybody made a terrific noise, shouting and yelling and stamping, cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged just a little minute more, then she stopped. She laughed in gasps. Her eyes sparkled just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too, and wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Suddenly, Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could into the kitchen. The fiddle had stopped playing. All the women were talking at once and all the men teasing George, but everybody was still for a minute when Grandma looked like that. Then she came to the door between the kitchen and the big room and said, "The syrup is waxing. Come and help yourselves." Then everybody began to talk and laugh again. They all hurried to the kitchen for plates and outdoors to fill the plates with snow. The kitchen door was open and the cold air came in. Outdoor, the stars were frosty in the sky and the air nipped Laura's cheeks and nose. Her breath was like smoke. She and the other Laura and all the other children scooped up clean snow with their plates. Then they went back into the crowded kitchen. Grandma stood by the brass kettle, and with the big wooden spoon she poured hot syrup on each plate of snow. It cooled into soft candy, and as fast as it cooled, they ate it. They could eat all they wanted, for maple sugar never hurt anybody. There was plenty of syrup in the kettle and plenty of snow outdoors. As soon as they ate one plate full, they filled their plates with snow again, and Grandma poured more syrup on it. When they had eaten the soft maple candy until they could eat no more of it, then they helped themselves from the long table loaded with pumpkin pies and dried berry pies and cookies and cakes. There was salt rising bread too, and cold boiled pork and pickles. Oh, how sour the pickles were. They all ate till they could hold no more, and then they began to dance again. But Grandma watched the syrup in the kettle. Many times she took a little of it out into the saucer and stirred it round and round. Then she shook her head and poured the syrup back into the kettle. The other room was loud and merry with the music of the fiddle and the noise of the dancing. At last, as Grandma stirred the syrup in the saucer, turned into little grains like sand, and Grandma called, "Quick, girls, it's graining!" Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docie and Ma left the dance and came running. They set out pans, big pans and little pans, and as fast as Grandma filled them with the syrup, they set out more. They set the filled ones away to cool into maple sugar. Then Grandma said, "Now bring the patty pans for the children." There was a patty pan or at least a broken cup or a saucer for every little girl and boy. They all watched anxiously while Grandma ladled out the syrup. Perhaps there would not be enough. Then somebody would have to be unselfish and polite. There was just enough syrup to go around. The last scrapings of the brass kettle exactly filled the very last patty pan. Nobody was left out. The fiddling and the dancing went on and on. Laura and the other Laura stood around and watched the dancers. Then they sat down on the floor in a corner and watched. The dancing was so pretty and the music so gay that Laura knew she could never get tired of it. All the beautiful skirts went swirling by, and the boots went stamping, and the fiddle kept on singing gaily. Then Laura woke up, and she was lying across the foot of Grandma's bed. It was morning. Ma and Grandma and baby Carrie were in the bed. Pa and Grandpa were sleeping, rolled up in blankets on the floor by the fireplace. Mary was nowhere in sight. She was sleeping with Aunt Docie and Aunt Ruby in their bed. Soon everybody was getting up. There were pancakes and maple syrup for breakfast, and then Pa brought the horses and sled to the door. He helped Ma and Carrie in while Grandpa picked up Mary and Uncle George picked up Laura, and they tossed them over the edge of the sled into the straw. Pa tucked in the robes around them, and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle George stood calling, "Goodbye, goodbye," as they rode away into the big woods going home. The sun was warm, and the trotting horses threw up bits of muddy snow with their hooves. Behind the sled, Laura could see their footprints, and every footprint had gone through the thin snow into the mud. Before night, Pa said, "We'll see the last of the sugar snow." All right, so boys and girls, you get out your sheets now and go back through like good detectives, looking through and see if you can correctly answer these questions in complete sentences. Number 5 is the only one you have a multiple choice option. So remember, subject, verb, complete sense, capital letter, and an end mark. Those are your 5 rules for your sentence. I miss you so much, you little cutie pies.